McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 15, Christianity and the Formation of Europe. Chapter outline: The rise of Christianity, Byzantium, the Middle Ages in Europe toward the Renaissance. The rise of Christianity. Early Christian art produced in the Roman Empire emphasized symbolism and narrative clarity, with signs adapted from pagan art. The rise of Christianity. Christianity was but one of numerous religions in the late Roman Empire, but it quickly became one of the most popular and well-organized. Rome's attitude towards this new cultural force within its borders varied. Often the faith was tolerated, and especially since it attracted some wealthy and influential people. At other times, Christians were persecuted, sometimes officially and sometimes by mobs. One of the reasons for the persecutions was that Christians refused to worship the gods and goddesses of the state religion, in addition to their own God. Christianity's situation changed abruptly in the year 313, when the Roman Emperor Constantine issued an edict of tolerance for all religions. Not only were all faiths now free to practice openly, but also Constantine himself patronized Christianity. While battling his political enemies in 312, Constantine had a vision of a cross with the inscription, "In this sign conquer." He interpreted this to mean that following Christian teachings would lead him to victory. He won the battle and converted to the Christian faith. His triumphal arch, seen here, a type of Roman monument built to commemorate victories, pictures the battle that secured his imperial title, as well as scenes of past emperors, triumphs, and the personification of victory. The relief sculpture is arrayed across the marble structure, which features a central barrel-vaulted passageway flanked by two smaller openings. A tall attic story includes an inscription celebrating Constantine's strength and divine inspiration. Erected in the center of Rome, next to the Colosseum, the arch symbolized the emperor's power and his imperial lineage. To decorate his arch, Constantine borrowed relief sculptures made for his predecessors. These images employ the naturalistic style of classical art. Reliefs commissioned by Constantine, on the other hand, reveal a very different approach. The panel picturing Constantine and his court features small stereotyped figures, drapery described with thick lines and limited spatial depth. The style of art in the Roman Empire had changed. The beauty of the human body was no longer important to artists. Now art emphasized symbolism, and the narrative clarity, with the signs borrowed from the pagan art, but repurposed with Christian meaning. The idealized bodies and individualized faces of the classical era had been replaced with stylized figures and generic facial features. Art reflected the Christian shift of attention from the well-being of the body to the cultivation of the soul. The sarcophagus containing the remains of the Roman patrician Junius Basius employs the same simplified style as Constantine's relief, as well as an assortment of Roman imagery borrowed for Christian purposes. The sarcophagus represents stories from Jesus' life and scenes from the Bible within a high-relief architectural setting. In the upper central section, Jesus appears between two figures. The artist based his divine likeness on Roman images of the youthful, beardless sun god Apollo. The enthroned Jesus shows his dominion over heaven and earth by resting his feet on another borrowed sign, a Roman personification of the heavens. The rise of Christianity. Early Christians adopted the Roman basilica form for churches that required space for congregations and had a clear hierarchy of spaces. Christian buildings also borrowed from Roman models. Under Constantine's imperial sponsorship, architects raised a series of large and opulent churches at key locations in the empire. One of these was Old St. Peter's, built on the spot in Rome where it was believed that Peter, Jesus' first apostle, had been buried. This structure was demolished in 1506 to make way for the new St. Peter's, which is still standing. but contemporary descriptions and drawings have enabled scholars to make informed guesses about its design. What should a church look like? Most Roman, Greek, and even Egyptian and Mesopotamian temples had essentially been conceived as dwelling places for the gods. Priests entered to perform rites of sacrifice and worship, but ordinary people viewed those rites from outside, if they viewed them at all. Christianity, from the beginning, emphasized congregational worship. A fundamentally different kind of building was needed, one that could contain a lot of people. Roman architects already had such a structure in their repertoire of standard building types, a multi-purpose meeting hall called a basilica. As the Roman plan shows, a basilica was basically a long rectangular hall. Entrances might be on the long or the short sides. Here they are on the long sides. At one or both ends, both in this example, might be a curved section called an apse. To admit light, the open central space, called a nave, extended up higher than the surrounding aisles. This upward extension was called a clerestory, and it was pierced with windows called clerestory windows. If you look back at the drawing of Old St. Peter's, you can now clearly see the central nave with its clerestory windows and the lower side aisles that buttress it. In the distance, at the far end of the nave, is the apse. Byzantinum. Byzantine church architecture used a central plan with a central dome symbolizing heaven. Byzantine church architecture used a central plan with a central dome symbolizing heaven, such as seen here with the example we saw earlier in the interior of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. A smaller gem of the early Byzantine style is San Vitel, built during the 6th century in Ravenna, Italy, which was then under Byzantine control. San Vitel does not follow the cross plan that became standard for Western churches, but instead uses a central plan favored in the East. Central plan churches are most often square with a central dome, as is the Hagia Sophia. San Vitel, however, takes the unusual form of an octagon. Although an apse protrudes from one wall and a narthex is attached to the two others, the fundamental focus of the building is at its center, over which rises a large dome. The major axis of the central plan of the church is thus vertical from the floor to the dome, or symbolically from the earth to the vault of heaven. And here's the interior of San Vitel. The interior of San Vitel is decorated in glittering mosaics. Gold and plant motifs in glass and ceramic create a feeling of otherworldly paradise and splendor. The scene over the apse represents a youthful Jesus Christ, flanked by angels and saints. He is dressed in imperial purple robes and sits on a globe to symbolize his power. The vault before the apse depicts Jesus as a sacrificial lamb held aloft in a wreath by 4 angels. Mosaics to either side depict the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Cain and Abel. The figures and the spaces are flat and static. Less attention is paid to the figures than to the symbols that they wear and carry. The purpose of San Vitel's mosaic imagery was informational, with the goal of helping the faithful to understand the stories and teachings of Christianity. Byzantinum. Moving farther away from Roman models, Byzantine icons became less naturalistic and more abstracted. A distinctive form of Byzantine art is the icon, named after the Greek word for image. In the context of Byzantine art, an icon is a specific kind of image, either a portrait of a sacred person or a portrayal of a sacred event. Icons were most commonly painted in tempera on gilded wood panels, like this image of Jesus from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sangali, Egypt, one of the earliest icons known to survive. Jesus Christ appears half-length, stoically staring at the viewer. He makes a sign of blessing with one hand and the other holds the Gospels that describe his life. While Jesus' flesh is modeled in light and shadow, his flattened body beneath his clothing and the gold halo behind his head take us beyond the earthly realm and into the spiritual. This mystical aspect would increase over the years as Byzantine icons became less naturalistic and more abstracted. We can see the effect of abstraction in Byzantine images, such as the Ebbs mosaic in the 12th century Cathedral Monreale in Sicily. Set in the half-dome is a large figure of Jesus Christ as the ruler of all, from the Sinai icon. A standard element of the later Byzantine iconography, the Pantocrator image emphasizes the divine, awe-inspiring, even terrifying majesty of the Christ, as opposed to his gentle, approachable human incarnation as Jesus. Directly below Christ is Mary, his mother, enthroned with the Christ child on her lap and flanked by angels and saints. Hierarchy of scale dictates that Christ, as the ruler of all, is larger than his mother, while she is larger than the saints surrounding her. Byzantinum. Periods of iconoclasm led to the destruction of Byzantine religious art. Icons had mysterious status in the Byzantine world. They were not images as we understand them, but points of contact with the sacred realm. Divine power flowed through them into the world, and through them believers could address their prayers to the sacred presence that they saw portrayed. Some icons were believed to have been miraculously created. Others were believed to have worked miracles. Yet, as discussed in Chapter 3, some people believe that icons had no place in the Byzantine Church. Their interpretation of the Hebrew Bible's second commandment led them to view icons as idols, images worshipped by the faithful. In the 8th and 9th centuries, officials with the Byzantine Church hierarchy banned idols, leading to violent iconoclastic outbursts as mosaics and paintings were stripped from churches. The destruction was depicted on the pages of a painted manuscript, pairing the abused Jesus Christ suffered on the cross at the top and the iconoclast covering up his image below. Because of these actions, the Sinai icon of Jesus numbers among the few icons from the early Byzantine era. The matter was resolved in the mid-9th century when Byzantine church authorities declared that sacred images were merely portraits and not the holy persons themselves. Abstracting the figures showed this distinction. The Middle Ages in Europe. Interlace and animal-style art in the early Middle Ages reflects the legacy and forms of earlier migratory people. Europe in the early Middle Ages was inhabited by descendants of migratory tribes that had traveled southward and westward on the continent during the 4th and 5th centuries. Ethnically Germanic, these people emerged for the most part from the north-central part of Europe, or what today would be called Germany and Scandinavia. The Romans referred to these people as barbarians, meaning foreigners, and they regarded them as crude, but they also admired their bravery and employed them as mercenaries. Nevertheless, the massive influx of barbarian tribes into the Roman lands, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as invaders and conquerors, brought about the empire's ultimate collapse near the end of the 5th century. By the year 600, there were fewer migrations, and the kingdoms whose area roughly approximated the nations of modern Europe had taken form. Their inhabitants had steadily converted to Christianity. And for the purpose of this discussion, we'll focus initially on the people who settled in two areas, the Angles and the Saxons in Britain and the Franks in Gaul, or modern France. On the island of Britain, northeast of London, was Sutton Hoo, where the grave of an unknown 7th century East Anglian king was found. Objects discovered at the burial site included the helmet, which we studied in Chapter 1, and this buckle. This cast buckle is covered in interlace, patterns formed by intricately interwoven ribbons and bands that seemingly endless design. Tracing these interwoven lines to the end reveals animal heads with larger eyes and mouths or beaks, some grasping still at other animals. The largest animals on the buckle appear along the upper and lower edges, their big beaks resting beside two smooth half-domes of gold. These motifs are typically of the animal style prevalent in the art of northwestern Europe at the time, a legacy very likely from the migratory herdsmen who were these people's ancestors. Among the most important artistic products of the early Middle Ages were the manuscripts of Christian scriptures. In the days before the printing press, each book had to be copied by hand. During the early Middle Ages, this copying was carried out in monasteries. Monks educated by the Roman Catholic Church were the only literate segment of the population. They not only copied text, but also illuminated them, furnishing them with illustrations and decorations. The illuminated manuscript here was made by monks of the British Isles and inspired by metalwork like the buckle. The design presents the first letters of the word Christ in Greek letters, and it shows how the monks adapted animal style and interlace for religious purpose. The two letters are highly stylized, with the chi exaggerated into an X-like form, dominating the page, and the rho tucked beneath as a small curling shape ending with a face, just as one of many abstracted humans and animals woven into the design. Each letter and its surrounding consists of multiple interlaced patterns in different widths and colors. The design is flat. The illumination seems to ask us to trace each line within the seemingly endless patterns before arriving at the bottom right of the page. There we find the beginning of the text. The Middle Ages in Europe. Carolingian art sought to revive forms from the Roman Empire under Byzantine rule. In France, a different style of art was taking root, called Carolingian, after the Emperor Charlemagne. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was a powerful Frankish king whose military conquest eventually gave him control over most of Western Europe. Like his father before him, Charlemagne was asked by the Pope for military help against the Lombards, a Germanic tribe that had conquered Ravenna and besieged Rome. In 800, he intervened yet again on the Pope's behalf, this time to restore order in Rome. On Christmas Day that year, a grateful Pope crowned Charlemagne Romanian Emperor, or Emperor of the Romans. It was the first time that the title had been used in the West in more than 300 years. Even before being crowned emperor, Charlemagne was well aware of his preeminence among the rulers of Europe. Frankish kings had traditionally moved from palace to palace throughout their realm. Charlemagne, while continuing this custom, also decided to build a permanent and more magnificent capital in Aachen, in present-day Germany. With papal permission, he transported marble, mosaics, and other materials from the buildings in Rome and Ravenna for his project. It is likely that he brought artisans as well, who worked side by side with their Frankish colleagues. The chapel from Charlemagne's monumental palace complex survived, incorporated into Aachen Cathedral. The Middle Ages in Europe. Romanesque architecture is characterized by Roman-looking forms and overall massiveness, thick stone walls, round arches, and barrel-vaulted stone ceilings. Historians generally divide art and architecture of the Middle Ages into two periods: the Romanesque from about 1050 to 1200, and the Gothic from about 1200 to the 15th century, which was created in northern France and spread from there. The Romanesque period was marked by a building boom. Contemporary Commentators were thrilled by the beautiful churches that seemed to be springing up everywhere. Later art historians called the style of these buildings Romanesque, for despite their great variety, they shared certain features reminiscent of ancient Roman architecture, including an overall massiveness, thick stone walls, round arches, and barrel-vaulted stone ceilings. One reason for the sudden emergence of buildings was the popularity of pilgrimages. In the newly prosperous and stable times of the 11th and 12th centuries, people could once again travel safely. Although some made the trip all the way to Jerusalem in the Holy Land, most confined their pilgrimages to sites associated with Christian saints in Europe. Churches and also lodgings and other services arose along the most popular pilgrimages routes as way stations for these large groups of travelers. The earliest Romanesque pilgrimages and churches still standing is the Abbey Church of Saint Foy in France. This aerial photograph clearly shows the church's cross-form plan. Even from the exterior, we can distinguish the nave, the slightly shorter aisles, and the transept. The two square towers flanked the entry portal, and an octagonal tower marks the intersection of the transept and the nave, an area known as the crossing. The round arches of the windows are continued in the interior, which has a barrel-vaulted nave and vaulted aisles. The interior of St. Foy reveals that, despite all its tall vaults and arches, Romanesque architecture is visually heavy and fragmented into separate units of space. The plan shows how Romanesque architects modified church design to accommodate large crowds of pilgrims. Aisles now line the transept as well as the nave and continue in a semicircle around the back of the apse, creating an ambulatory, or Latin for walkway. Small chapels radiate from the ambulatory. The apse itself is now preceded by an area called the choir. Together, apse and choir serve as a small church within a church, allowing monks to perform their rites even as pilgrims walked through the building. The Middle Ages in Europe. Reliquaries honor deceased holy persons and were the focus of pilgrimage. Pilgrims stopping at St. Foy would have come to see the relics of St. Foy herself, which were kept there in a statue made of hammered gold over a wooden core and set with gems. St. Foy, known in English as St. Faith, was supposed to have been put to death as a young girl, possibly in the 3rd century, for refusing to worship pagan gods. As they did for other martyrs, believers collected pieces of Foy's body, in this case the skull, as a physical focus for veneration. The Middle Ages in Europe. Typical Romanesque visual characteristics emphasize symbols over nature and include stylization, elongation, hierarchy of style, and stereotyped figures. The reliquary statue of St. Foy is an example of the treasures that were offered to and displayed in medieval churches. The plaque with Christ presenting the keys to St. Peter and the law to St. Paul was also made for a church. This ivory relief features Jesus Christ standing on a dome structure that represents the heavenly Jerusalem. He offers keys and a scroll to Peter and Paul, who receive these gifts reveringly with hands covered. The keys refer to Jesus' statement to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and these gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 16:18-19. Peter was designated as the first leader or pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Keys remained the symbol of the pope even today. The scrolls of Jesus gives Paul is the law which Paul received and interpreted for those he converted to Christianity. By the Middle Ages, Paul's writings guided much of Christian practice. The Romanesque period was succeeded in the 12th century by the Gothic era. The term Gothic derives from the Goths, who were among the many nomadic tribes sweeping through Europe during the 4th and 5th centuries. It was applied to this style by later critics of the Renaissance, who considered the art and architecture of their immediate predecessors to be vulgar and barbarian. Yet the people in the 12th century found the new style to be beautiful and appropriately lavish way of honoring their faith. The Gothic style was started by a powerful French abbot named Suger, who wanted to enlarge and remodel his church. The Abbey Church of Saint-Denis near Paris, inspired by early Christian writings. He came to believe that an ideal church should have certain characteristics. It should appear to reach up to heaven. It should have a harmonious proportions, and it should be filled with light. To fulfill these goals, his architects responded with pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows so large that they seemed like translucent walls. The cathedral at Chartres in France shows the soaring quality of Gothic architecture with pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. Here, the unadorned earthbound masses of the Romanesque have given way to ornate, linear, vertical elements that direct the eye upward. Clearly visible are the flying buttresses that line the nave and the apse to contain the outward thrust of the ribbed vaults and walls. Because proportions of Chartres were built at different times, the cathedral also shows the evolution of Gothic style. For example, the first thing most people notice about the cathedral is the mismatched corner towers and the spires. The south left tower and its spire were completed between 1142 and 1160. Designed in the very earliest Gothic style, they were conceived so that each level grows out of the one before, and all the elements work together to lead the eye upward. The north, to the right tower, although it was begun earlier, was finished much later in a Gothic style that is thin and elegant and highly ornamented. The tower's facade had originally been built as additions to older Romanesque church that stood on the site. When a fire in 1194 burned this older part of the church to the ground, it was rebuilt over the course of the next 60 years in a Gothic style which we see today. The plan shows the familiar cross form, but the choir and the ambulatory have taken on much larger proportions compared with those of Saint Foy. The soaring open spaces of the interior were created with ribbed vaulting and pointed arches, much like those that we saw in Chapter 13 in the cathedral at Reims, built around the same time. The final addition to the Chartreuse was the spire atop the northern tower. Built in the early 16th century, it illustrates the last phase of the Gothic style, a slender, elongated, and highly ornamental style called flamboyant, or French for flame-like. An example of the ornate, linear Gothic style of architecture, which began in France and sought height and light. The Middle Ages in Europe. Sculpted and painted figures became more naturalistic throughout the Gothic period. Sculpture in the Middle Ages was often created to embellish architecture. Over 2,000 carved figures decorate the exterior of the Chartreuse Cathedral. Concentrated especially around the principal entryways, they serve as a transition between the everyday world of the tower and the sacred space within, reminding viewers of the stories and heroes of the faith as they enter. Like the architecture itself, the sculptures were created at different times, and in them, too, we can appreciate the evolution of the Gothic forms. A group of carved figures adorning one of the doorways at Chartreuse reveals the change in style. The figures to the right side have narrow and flattened bodies that look like columns covered in priest robes. They seem to float somewhat as if their bodies had no weight or they were suspended in midair. The figure of Saint Theodore at the far left, on the other hand, has weight on his feet. A sense of underlying musculature is evident in the chain metal covering his arm, and his garment, although not fully naturalistic, is carved with an awareness of the body underneath. St. Theodore also moves just free of his supporting column, turning his head and resting his weight on one leg. This figure seems alive. In the homes belonging to royalty, nobility, and wealthy merchants in the late Middle Ages would have been found illuminated manuscripts on religious and secular themes. The history of the French royal line is presented in a group of painted manuscripts known as the Great Chronicles of France. Begun in the 13th century at the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, the manuscripts trace the history of the French royal lineage from the ancient Troy to the 15th century. The page seen here is from the life of the King Charlemagne and recounts the death of a knight named Roland, a tragic hero described in many 11th century epic poems. Roland served in Charlemagne's army and died in 778 fighting the Muslim invaders sweeping through Spain on their way north. The painting shows Roland's dead body lying on the ground while two angels lift his soul towards heaven. Like the early Gothic sculpture at Chartreuse, the painting abstracts the figures, giving them large heads and thin bodies. Yet, like the sculpture of St. Theodore's, Roland's fallen body twists on its axis, and the painter modeled the figure in light and shadow to suggest its three-dimensionality. The Middle Ages in Europe. Luxury arts for the home during the Middle Ages included tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and tableware. A smaller sculpture, such as this one, is an example of some of the luxury arts that were found in homes during the Middle Ages. Tapestries were among the many luxury arts found in upper-class homes in the Middle Ages. Derived from the Latin word for water, aqua, and hand, manus, and aqua manel held water used for ritual hand washing. Aqua manels were used by priests who washed their hands at an altar before celebrating Mass. They were also used in secular settings by aristocrats and wealthy merchants whose dinner rituals included washing their hands in water perfumed with orange peel and herbs. Often fashioned in the form of animals, the metal vessels may have originated in Persia. They were used for centuries in the Islamic world before finding their way into European culture in the Middle Ages. Toward the Renaissance, Italian artists introduced new naturalism in the treatment of light and space to their art in the 14th century. Toward the Renaissance, the Gothic style lasted in Northern Europe well into the 15th century. By that time, however, it was overlapping with far different ideas about art that had their origins in Italy. Living in the heart of what had been the ancient Roman Empire, Italians were surrounded by artifacts awaiting excavation and an intellectual climate that encouraged interest in the classical world. That climate eventually arose, and we call it the Renaissance. But the Renaissance did not happen all at once. Many developments prepared the way, some in scholarship, some in political thought, others in art. The last two artists in this chapter shifted art from the medieval style towards the Renaissance approach. Boccaccio was an artist in Siena, Italy. His temper painting, the Nativity with the prophets Elijah and Ezekiel, formed part of a larger work known as the Modesta altarpiece, made for the Siena Cathedral. Boccaccio's paintings has much in common with the Byzantine icons discussed earlier in this chapter. In particular, the figures appear against a gold background, taking them out of the worldly realm in favor of a divine space. Hierarchy of scale in the central scene makes the Virgin Mary much larger than the shepherds. At the same time, the figures of Elijah and Ezekiel to either side seem three-dimensional. Their faces and arms are modeled in light and shadow, and the folds of their clothing fall naturally. The relationship of the body and the clothing is clarified in the center panel's foreground. Here, the gown on the woman holding the Christ child suggests a three-dimensional body beneath, including the legs foreshortened to appear to be jutting out of the painting. Duccio's contemporary Florentine artist named Giotto made an even more remarkable break with the art of the Middle Ages. In his most famous work, a cycle of frescoes on the walls of the Scrovanian chapel in Padua, Giotto used a grid of decorative bands to create 3 registers of rectangular narrative scenes. In each panel, he painted an episode from the life of either Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary. One episode is the rising of Lazarus, which depicts Jesus receiving a man who died several days earlier. The scene is composed as though it were on a stage, and viewers participate in the drama. The space receding from the picture plane seems to be continuous with the space in front of the picture plane where viewers stand. We are accustomed to this now, to this window effect in painting, but it was revolutionary during the Middle Ages, which was dominated by mostly flat decorative space in painting. Moreover, Giotto seems to have developed this concept of space largely on his own, with little artistic precedent. The figures in the Rising of Lazarus are modeled to look round and full-bodied, as suggested by the drapery of the kneeling woman. Clustered low in the composition, these figures enhance the effect of the real event taking place. Toward the Renaissance, Giotto created art that looked like a window onto the world, including natural bodies, spaces, and emotions. Giotto's grouping of the figures seems casual and almost random, but notice the slope of the hill directing our attention to Jesus Christ, the focal point of the composition. Yet another innovation, perhaps Giotto's most important one, was his interest in depicting the psychological and emotional reactions of his subjects. The characters in The Rising of Lazarus react in a natural, human way that gives this and the artist's other religious scenes a unique familiarity for its era. Some pull their hands back in astonishment at the sight of the resurrected man. Others fall to the ground in reverence, and one off to the far right covers her nose to avoid the stench. Neither Duccio or Giotto had an especially long career. Each did his most significant work in the first decade of the 14th century. Yet in that short time, the course of Western art history changed dramatically. Both artists had sought a new direction for painting, a more naturalistic, more human, more engaging representation of the physical world, and both had taken giant steps in that direction. Their experiments have paved the way for a flowering of all the arts that would come in the next century. This concludes Chapter 15.